Hello, welcome to lesson 22 of Learning New Testament Greek. This is part of a series of lessons that is working through John chapter 1. And this lesson will cover John chapter 1 verse 35 to 42, and then lesson 23 will take us to the end of chapter 1. So now, John chapter 1 verse 35 to 42. Verse 35, Te epaurion palin hesteke ho Ioannis, kai ek ton matheton autu duo. Te epaurion, the next day, palin again, hesteke ho Ioannis, stands John, again verb and subject following it, kai ek ton matheton autu duo, and of his disciples, two. Duo as in duet, duo meaning two. One of the two disciples mentioned here is Andrew, and we see his name in verse 40. The other must be John, since he isn't identified at all, and typically John doesn't identify himself. But this narrative is evidently an eyewitness account, so we can be pretty sure that these two disciples here are Andrew and John. Kai ekusan hoi duo mathetai autu laluntos, kai ekoluthesan to Jesu. And they heard, the two disciples, they heard, autu lalontos, they heard him talking. So this is the genitive. As a first approximation, we would translate it as of him or his. But it happens in Greek that the person that you hear is put in the genitive, so they heard him. Laluntos kai ekoluthesan to Jesu. So this is the dative. Again, in English we would just say they followed Jesus, but in Greek you have to say they followed to Jesus, using the dative. Interesting here about the word follow. Here it's used just in the ordinary sense, like go along behind someone, but also there is a hint of the technical sense of become a disciple of someone. But I think basically we say it's just used here in the ordinary sense. In verse 43, it's clearly used in the technical sense, to become a disciple. But then following on again, in John chapter 6 verse 2, it's used again in a non-technical sense. So the non-technical sense is just follow, just go along behind somebody, and the technical sense of it is to follow in the sense of become a disciple, which we find in verse 43. But the interesting thing to me is that here's a word, it's used interchangeably. It's used first here in the non-technical sense, and then later it's used in the technical sense, and then later on again it's used in the non-technical sense. This is important to note because a lot of people think that the Greek words of the New Testament have precise, invariable, technical meanings, but it's simply not true. This is just ordinary language. The words are used in ordinary senses, and occasionally they have one sense, occasionally they have another. So we shouldn't expect the words here to have carefully defined, non-overlapping technical meanings. When a lot of people do that, effectively treating the New Testament like a theological textbook, it's not. The words, this is just written in ordinary language, and the words have ordinary meanings and variable meanings. Sometimes they overlap each other, and sometimes they don't. So we can't expect technical precision, like as if this was a theological textbook or a scientific document or a legal document. No, this is just ordinary language. And so here they just follow Jesus in the ordinary sense. But the next time we find this word used, it's used without warning, really, in a technical sense, in verse 43 of becoming his disciples. They're not yet ready for that at this stage. Verse 38, Strafes de ho Jesus, kai theasamenos autus, acoluthuntas, lege autois, ti tetete, hoi de epan auto, rabbi, ho legetai, methermenuomenon, didaskele, pumenes. So turning, but turning Jesus and seeing them following, he says, present again, he says to them, what are you seeking? So this could be, again, this word has two meanings. It could just mean seeking something in the normal sense of have you lost something, or it could mean seeking in a deeper sense. What are you looking for in a deeper sense, in a spiritual sense, perhaps? And they were perhaps a little bit surprised by suddenly being asked this, which I think in English we would perhaps indicate by saying, Rabbi, where are you staying? They have to think of something to say. Where are you staying? It's a bit of a random question, but they were put on the spot by Jesus asking them, and so they had to say something. So they said, where are you staying? Interestingly here, this rabbi is the exact Hebrew word, preserved, that they used, and in brackets John has put a translation of it into Greek, which says methermenuomenon didaskele, teacher. So this means translated, methermenuomenon. So this part of it is the same as meta, which is carried across, and from this we get the word hermeneutics, which means the hermeneutics is the study of trying to find out the meaning of the words of the Bible, hermeneutics. But here it's just a normal word, and as a unit this word means translated, which says, translated, teacher. Pumenes, where are you staying? Lege autois, ercheste kai obseste. He says to them, come and see. Elthan kai edan pumene, kai parautu emenan ten hemeran ekenen. They came then, so they came, and they saw where he stays, and with him they stayed the day that day. Hora ein hos decate, that's the end of verse 39. Hora ein hos decate, the hour. So this is hora, and it's related to our English word hour. The hour was about, hos is as or like, in this case about, decate, 10, the 10th hour. It's interesting how John is quite an exact observer of things like time. He frequently notes the time of day when things happen. In the 10th hour, that's the Roman custom of dividing the day into 12 hours from sunrise to sunset. So the hour was about 10, meaning it's about 2 hours before sunset. So that's why they stayed with him. They didn't have much time to go anywhere else. You can be sure that they had a lot more questions to ask him, and Jesus had a lot more things to say to them. Just another interesting point here. We have 3 words for see that have been used in these verses. In verse 36 we had emblepsas, in verse 38 theasamenos, another word, and in verse 39 obseste. So 3 different words for see. And again, if you read the commentaries, they would try to make fine distinctions between these words, and maybe there is something to be said for that. But generally I find, especially the older commentators, can really exaggerate that, and I think a lot of it is perhaps just put down to stylistic variation. But there's something that you can study, and if you want to look carefully at the context in which each word is used, you can perhaps draw some conclusions for yourself and then check it with other contexts. But it is quite interesting that in the space of just 3 or 4 verses, 3 different words are used for see, and also the words have different forms as well. So that's something that you can look up if you're interested in that sort of thing. Anyway, we come down to verse 40. Ein Andreas ha adelphos Simonos Petru, heis ek ton duo ton accusanton par Iesu, kai akoluthe santon auto. He was, Andrew, again, Andrew was, Andrew, the brother of Simon Peter. He was one of the 2 who heard from John and followed him. In this case, the him is Jesus, but it's not mentioned. In translation, we'd probably need to make that explicit. They heard from John and they followed Jesus. 41. Huriske hutos proton ton edelphon ton idion Simona kai legeauto hurekamen ton messian hoestin methermenuomenon Christos. Huriske, he finds this person, this fellow, Andrew, finds first ton edelphon ton idion, his own brother, his brother Simon, and says to him, Hurekamen. So this is like the famous statement that we have was made by Archimedes, Eureka, Hurekamen, we have found. Archimedes said, Eureka, I have found it. Hurekamen, we have found the Messiah. Haesten methermenuomenon Christos. So Messiah is the Greek form, and Messiah is the Hebrew or Aramaic form, and Christos is the Greek form. It means the anointed one, so the anointed king, or the special king, the Messiah, the anointed one. So Christos in Greek means anointed. And again we have this methermenuomenon translated, which is translated. But interestingly, this Hebrew word, the Hebrew word which here is just translated letter by letter, messian, here it's translated for meaning, but here it's just translated letter by letter, Messiah. It's used only twice in the New Testament, only here and at chapter 4 verse 25. I guess this is a pretty momentous occasion for them all, so John gives the actual Aramaic word which Andrew would have uttered. Lots of Jews in New Testament times were hoping for a David-like king and warrior who would drive out the Romans, so they had a little bit to learn too when Jesus didn't quite meet those expectations. Verse 42, Egagen auton pros ton Iesun. He led, or he took him to Jesus. And of course this clause has become a famous one in evangelical use, leading someone to the Lord. He led his brother to Jesus. Emblepsas autu ha Jesus epen, seeing him, Jesus said, Su e Simon ha huios Ioannou, you are Simon, the son of John. Su kletese Kephas ha hermeneuetai Petros. So here notice we have a shorter form of this word, but again there's no intended difference in meaning. Here we had it with the prefix, but here without the prefix. Ha hermeneuetai, which is translated Petros. Kephas, which is translated Petros. Now in English this is often written like that, and so because the C in English can have 2 sounds, but here it's usually read as Cephas, but the original is Kephas, which is following the sound in Aramaic. So kephas is Aramaic for rock or stone, and petros is Greek for rock or stone, just like we have petrify, which actually means to become stone or to make into stone. So petros is the translation of kephas. Now interestingly, the next time that John mentions him, he uses petros and not kephas. So it's interesting that Jesus said you're going to be called kephas, and so John preserves that exact word, but John himself just continues to, he continues to use the Greek translation of that form petros. But we do find it interesting that Paul usually refers to Peter by his Aramaic name Kephas. So you find that, for example, in the letter to Galatians and the letters to the Corinthians, where he refers usually to Kephas, using Jesus' pet name for Peter, Kephas, in the original Aramaic form, whereas more common is the translation. And you still also see a little bit of his original name. Well, here we have them joined together in verse 40, Simonos Petru, Simon Peter. So here we find Jesus is collecting his disciples, and interestingly, he finds pairs of brothers, and he recruits them to be his disciples.